he is in peril as Prime Minister. This is very bad for Keir Starmer, but it takes a lot for Labour MPs to act, and there are things that are holding them back.
We've got war in Europe, war in the Gulf. Now, we can't have a breakdown in relations between the Prime Minister and the Foreign Office. This has been very damaging. Couldn't really have come at a worse time, but they need to start the rebuilding of trust now.
I served in Keir Starmer's shadow cabinet. I worked very closely with him. He's a man of great integrity.
This is a wider thing than just the culture within the civil service, isn't it? This is an issue with the Prime Minister who always finds someone else to blame except himself. Hello and welcome to the Fourcast. Peter Mandelson's appointment as ambassador to the US was a rush job carried out under an atmosphere of pressure from 10 Downing Street and a, quote, dismissive attitude to security vetting. That's the claim by Sir Olly Robbins, the sacked head of the Foreign Office, as he was grilled by Parliament's Foreign Affairs Select Committee. So, is it now clear what happened behind the scenes? Number 10 denies Robbins' characterisation of events, but could this still be damning for Starmer's premiership? Or has his sacking of a senior mandarin now been vindicated? Later, I'll be speaking to Labour MP Preet Kour Gill, but now I'm joined by one of Olly Robbins' predecessors as head of the Foreign Office, Lord Ricketts, and political commentator Sonia Sodha, who was an advisor to Ed Miliband when he was Labour leader. The one thing that we learned pretty quickly today, and that Olly Robbins said himself, was that he did not pass crucial information onto Downing Street. So, Sonia, was it a win for Keir Starmer?
No, I don't think so. I mean, that was one aspect of Keir Starmer's account of what happened that Olly Robbins did back up. But I think it was extremely clear from the accounts that Olly Robbins gave to the committee, that I thought was very credible, that he thought he was following procedure, Foreign Office procedure, Foreign Office guidance. He made it very clear this is a department where thousands of people have this vetting. This is the process as it follows. So although it might sound extraordinary to us outside of government that there were things that went on in this process that were not revealed to ministers, I think it was very clear that Olly Robbins thought he was under an obligation not to disclose what went on beneath the vetting process to ministers. So I don't think it helped out Keir Starmer in that sense. And in fact, I think there were a number of revelations about things that we were not aware of before, which I'm sure that we're going to come on to, which are incredibly problematic for Keir Starmer.
Lord Ricketts, for those of us who aren't familiar with the inner machinations of the civil service, put us in that mindset. Tell us, what's it like? And can you imagine a situation where you're not told explicitly, but you are given no uncertain terms of the decision, the outcome that you think your political masters want you to come to?
I think Sonia's right, first of all. I think at the heart of this is a massive misunderstanding between the civil servants and the politicians about what this vetting process is about. And the Prime Minister therefore went off the deep end when he thought he'd been denied information by Olly Robbins, that became crucial. Just to make the point, it only became crucial because the Mandelson ambassadorship in Washington blew up in midair and he was fired. And at that point, the detail of his vetting before he went became super political and toxic. But I mean, yes, of course, civil servants want to do what they understand ministers require. And it was pretty clear to the Foreign Office, as Olly made clear, there was enormous pressure to get the Mandelson appointment through and get him to Washington before Trump arrived. And that meant things were happening very quickly. It meant the Prime Minister had announced the appointment, had got the King's agreement to the appointment, even the Americans' agreement, even before starting this vetting process. So the system was under pressure.
Can you do a little bit of explaining to us here? Because the impression that I and lots of other journalists and the public have been left under by Downing Street is that this vetting comes down to a yes, no, pass or fail. Peter Mandelson was a no. He was a fail. And then Olly Robbins has decided, now I know I've got this piece of paper that says he's a fail, but actually I'm now going to pass him. Is that how it works? Is that what you're presented with when you get this vetting?
No, it's not in the Foreign Office. I mean, it turns out that for many government departments, it seems that's to be the case. Because the government produced that bit of paper, now famous, which had the sort of green, yellow, red markings, and Mandelson was a red, and therefore he'd failed his vetting. I'd never seen a piece of paper like that. And Olly explained very carefully that in the Foreign Office, vetting is a more nuanced process, that you go through all the possible risks. The professionals do, this security vetting team. They come up with the problems they see, the risks that they see, and the possible mitigations. And then they discuss that with their civil service decision maker, in this case Olly Robbins. So they don't present him a pass or fail tick box thing. They present him with the risks, and we were told by Olly that they were leaning in favour of rejection, but it was borderline, and they wanted to talk to him about it. And he, quite rightly, apparently under the procedure that exists, decided they could be mitigations, and therefore he approved the vetting. So there was no failing of vetting followed by an overriding by Olly Robbins. That's not how the process worked. What a pity the Prime Minister didn't get a briefing on how the vetting process worked in the kind of clarity that Olly Robbins set out for the committee today, because then he might have understood Robbins wasn't overriding something and failing to tell ministers. He'd finished off the process had been done. It's true what the Prime Minister said, due diligence was followed. It's just that he didn't understand what due diligence was.
So I can't remember a select committee hearing in which people were waiting for it with a bowl of popcorn quite like this, possibly since Dominic Cummings was last in front of a select committee. What did we actually learn from this today, or what bits surprised you most?
Well, there were a few things. I think, first of all, I think Olly Robbins gave us a lot of colour about the pressure that was exerted by Number 10 in terms of getting Peter Mandelson kind of through the initial stages of the process, because they were very keen to have him as ambassador of the US. So I think there was that. One thing that really surprised me was the fact that the Cabinet Office, according to Olly Robbins, and this is before he took up his post as permanent secretary at the Foreign Office, was actually pressurising the Foreign Office, saying, we don't think Mandelson needs to go through a vetting because he's already a member of the House of Lords. I thought that was quite extraordinary and doesn't sit well with Downing Street's accounts that if they'd known, they would have promptly kind of unappointed Mandelson, even though he'd been announced. So I thought that was really quite seismic. The third thing that I thought was incredibly important was that we found out that actually Downing Street had asked about another potential political appointment to the senior echelons of the diplomatic service. That's Matthew Doyle, Starmer's former director of communications. He was then subsequently put into the House of Lords and had to resign the Labour whip, or actually was suspended from the Labour whip very quickly because of reporting that he went and campaigned for somebody who was charged with child sex offences. I think it was for a local councillor position, and that person subsequently went on to be convicted, which obviously shows extremely poor judgment. You're going out and asking the voters to vote for somebody who's been charged with very serious offences. So this is not somebody who is considered fit to take the Labour whip in the House of Lords, let alone be parachuted into a senior job in the Foreign Office, which meant that another long-standing civil servant would have to lose their job. So I thought that really kind of spoke to me of a sweeties for mates culture in Number 10 that I thought was already apparent, in fact, in the way that Matthew Doyle was eventually parachuted into the Lords instead of the Foreign Office.
To be fair to the government, they would say actually a lot of those revelations about Matthew Doyle came out after his appointment to the House of Lords, and at the time when it looked like someone from government was trying to parachute him into a nice plum ambassadorialship, he was merely just not very good at his job in Downing Street.
Yes, well, not very good at his job in Downing Street. I think that sort of says a lot, doesn't it, really? But, I mean, you've worked with someone for a number of years. You might have a clue about judgment calls that they took, like the one that Matthew Doyle clearly made in the past. So, yes, Number 10 would say, well, we suspended him from the Labour whip as soon as we found out about these revelations in the press. But what does it say about the Prime Minister that he had to be told that by the press about his own Director of Communications judgment? I think that kind of raises questions, doesn't it?
Lord Ricketts, what did you say that perked an eyebrow?
I did raise a diplomatic eyebrow, yes. Olly Robbins was instructed not to tell the Foreign Secretary that Number 10 was hunting for a post for Matthew Doyle. That shows, the really difficult pressures that these top civil servants can be put under by Number 10. They were pressing hard for Mandelson to get to Washington, possibly without even vetting. They were trying to position, one of their friends in a plush ambassadorial job. And to his great credit, Olly Robbins stood out against that, and that was fairly quickly dropped. So it's quite a pressured environment. But I think, one of the stories that has come out of this is real tensions between Number 10, and now the Prime Minister, and the civil service. And I think a lesson is that the Prime Minister's got to work now to restore relations with the civil service, rebuild trust. We do need the functioning relationship between Number 10 and the civil servant. Heaven knows, we've got crises in all directions. We've got war in Europe, war in the Gulf. We can't have a breakdown in relations between the Prime Minister and the Foreign Office. So I think there's a big job of work to rebuild trust, get a new leader into the Foreign Office soon, because this has been very damaging at a time when they're going through quite wrenching change and downsizing in the Foreign Office. It couldn't really have come at a worse time, but they need to start the rebuilding of trust now.
One of the points I'm sure Downing Street will make to me at some point is that, look, for all those revelations that the pair of you have pointed out that came out during the evidence session, is that Olly Robbins is talking about people in Downing Street, not Keir Starmer himself. So is Keir Starmer vindicated? Has Olly Robbins' evidence at the Select Committee here vindicated everything that Keir Starmer was saying in Parliament yesterday? Effectively, I am outraged and I cannot believe that I personally have not been told all of these things.
No, I don't think so, because I think there are questions about Keir Starmer. And when you take a step back from this and look at the big picture, we mustn't forget that one of the reasons why there was so much pressure on the Foreign Office, one of the reasons why the Cabinet Office was saying to the Foreign Office, this guy doesn't even need to go through the vetting, was because of Starmer's original decision to appoint, at least announce the appointment of Mandelson. So it was effectively done, as it were, before he'd gone through the vetting process. And that went against the advice of Sir Simon Case. And all we have now is Keir Starmer's word that had he known that Peter Mandelson had failed, in inverted commas, his vetting, obviously the Foreign Office would put it a different way. They would say there were concerns flagged. But had he known that, he would have not gone ahead with the appointment. And I think, A, that's a counterfactual, and B, that there were some real reasons to think that maybe that's not what would have happened. Partly the fact that Cabinet Office didn't seem to be that bothered about the vetting to the extent that they said it shouldn't even be happening in the first place. But I thought it was also very interesting what Olly Robbins said about potential diplomatic fallout. There'd been pressure put on the US and on Washington to go through the process that they have to approve a British ambassador to the US. And there was clearly not just going to be a lot of political fallout, but potentially diplomatic fallout as well, if Peter Mandelson was going to, if we euphemistically call it, be unappointed as a result of the outcome of the vetting process.
How bad then do you think all this has been? Or how bad do you think today's been for Keir Starmer?
I think it's really quite bad in terms of the questions it raises about Keir Starmer's own judgment. I think it also raises some very serious questions about Keir Starmer's actions after he found out about all of this, because it sounds to me like what happened was he got very angry and he decided quite quickly to sack Olly Robbins, to put pressure on him to go. Olly Robbins now says he's had a dismissal letter this week. And I thought it was clear from what Olly Robbins said that some of the stuff that the Prime Minister has been saying in terms of Olly Robbins's accountability, his responsibility, was not even put to Olly Robbins before he was dismissed. And that seems to be quite a serious breach of due process in relation to somebody who is a very well-respected public servant. So I think this is very bad for Keir Starmer. The thing I will say, again, looking at the big picture, is that things were already pretty bad for him politically before this happened. So does this make a material difference in the here or now to how long Keir Starmer has got left in Downing Street? That I'm less clear on, because I think there's no way that he's going to go before the local elections unless he resigns anyway. There's absolutely no way his party are going to look to get him out of Downing Street. And even after the local elections, the process might take some time. So it's done him no favours. Does it materially change his fortunes, in the next 2 to 3 weeks? Probably not, from my perspective.
We'll come back to his future in a second, but Lord Ricketts, just picking up on some of those points there, do you think there's a case now where Keir Starmer might be slightly regretting going to war with the civil service, might be slightly regretting firing Olly Robbins?
I hope so. I'll leave Sonia with the political analysis, but I think now he, as everybody else, will be clearer about what exactly Olly was doing, and the fact that he was carefully following long-established process designed to ensure that the actual detail of the vetting process stays secret. As Olly said, thousands of people go through developed vetting. They have to lay bare their personal life, their financial affairs, their contacts. There can be an awful lot of very intrusive information there. So it has to be, as he put it, in a box and kept in a box with only the outcome of the process disclosed to ministers. And I think if the Prime Minister had understood that better and understood there was no hiding or obfuscation or overriding going on in the Foreign Office, it was scrupulous observing of the rules, he might have come to a different conclusion. And as Sonia says, it did seem to be, a decision taken in anger on the basis of, let's say, incomplete advice and evidence, that this very distinguished, talented civil servant, who is committed to national security and spent 25 years looking after the interests of the country, is suddenly fired, leaving a big gap at the top of the Foreign Office. So, yeah, I hope there's a bit of reflection goes on about the quality of the briefing he had. No doubt he was entirely, he meant it when he said that he was angry and it was staggering. But if he'd understood what was actually going on, I think perhaps he would have thought twice about sacking Olly and making sure that he understood the system better in the future.
Lord Ricketts, are you not a little surprised, at least, that Olly Robbins might not have maybe even had a conversation with his line manager, the cabinet secretary, Sir Chris Wormald, just saying, look, this is what's come back to me during the developed vetting process. This is where I'm thinking of leaning to. What are your thoughts? But instead, he just kept it all to himself.
Olly explained at length to the committee why he didn't feel he could go to his line manager and say, look, there's been a wrinkle or two, but we're sorting it out, it'll be okay. Because as soon as you do that, you open this sealed box of the vetting material, you invite further questions as to what the wrinkles might be, you transfer the kind of responsibility of decision-taking away, and therefore you put at risk this very intrusive process of vetting, which requires individuals to lay out their personal details, their financial details, their contacts, in a way which can damage the system. So he decided he would take the responsibility. He thought that was his job. He didn't share the process that led up to the decision, and that had always been the way decision-making on vetting had been done. Now, I mean, people can question that, but it seems to me he laid that out in a very persuasive way, and in a way which showed that he took his responsibilities very seriously.
Sonia, take yourself back 2 years. If you were playing future political bingo, would you have at any point put the former chief public prosecutor going to war with the civil service as being the thing that you thought might be the political scandal of the future?
I wouldn't have necessarily predicted that this would have come up in quite the way that it did, I have to say. But for me personally, as somebody who's observed British politics, for the last however long it is, I do think there were signs that Keir Starmer has actually got quite poor judgment as a Prime Minister on a range of issues. Some might say it even goes back so far as to the fact that he chose to serve under Jeremy Corbyn's shadow cabinet at a point where actually lots of people who are senior in the Labour Party now who are in cabinet positions chose to do senior roles on the backbenches instead. So some might even say that showed poor judgment. Some people might say it's a fact that he clearly sort of adopted a position that would get him elected by party members as leader. That's not a position he's really stuck to as Prime Minister. So there are all kinds of questions, I think, to be asked about his judgment that make me not necessarily, I wouldn't have predicted this particular crisis potentially, but I'm not surprised that he's run into hot water, because I'm not sure that his approach to governing and to government is one that's necessarily conducive to being a prime minister and running, being on top of a machine that is as complex as government.
Lord Ricketts, given everything that you've seen unfold over the last week or so, if you were back in the civil service right now, how confident would you be that your political masters are always looking out for you? Or would you always be a little bit nervous now that you might be one mistake away from being thrown under a bus?
Well, I think the impact of this on other senior civil servants sort of working in and around Olly Robbins and with Number 10 can only be damaging. But I think you can overdo this sort of chilling effect on the civil service business. I was in the Foreign Office yesterday, as it turns out. I mean, people are getting on with their jobs. Most people wouldn't have actually met Olly Robbins. There's massive issues that they have to deal with. They're a resilient professional organisation.
Sonia, is this something that just a couple of political journalists and a former civil servant and a few people in SW1 are worried about? Or do you think this is actually cutting through with the public?
I think that's, I would be surprised if it's got massive cut through, to be honest. I would imagine that people may have just clocked that there's more stuff that's come out about Peter Mandelson and the way he was appointed. And I would expect that somebody who just kind of follows the news occasionally would know perhaps that something's going on with Peter Mandelson, but that's kind of pretty much all they need to know. And in many ways, voters don't need to concern themselves with the detail and the ins and outs of this. That doesn't, however, mean that it's not very important, and that it's not important for Parliament to be scrutinising this and for journalists to be trying to uncover what went on behind the scenes. Because while this may not matter to every single voter, it goes to really important questions, I think, about how ministers and the civil service work together. I think it goes to important questions about the character of our Prime Minister, whether he's prepared to take responsibility for poor judgment calls, or whether, as I sort of think the evidence suggests, he's rather quick to make other people cop the blame for things that are really, he should step up and say, look, I run the government, I'm the Prime Minister, the buck stops with me. So even though the public may not be engaged with every twist and turn, it's a very technical story, I still think it's very important that journalists and Parliament are scrutinising this.
So what do you think it means for his future, Sonia?
I think his future was already hanging in the balance. I think that Labour MPs are dissatisfied enough with him now and with his performance in the polls. And that's not just to do with this. This is to do with, his popularity ratings. It's to do with what's going on in the economy, that he is in peril as Prime Minister. That said, there are a number of things that act in his favour if he wants to stick around. One is there's absolutely no way his party will act against him before the local elections. They want him to own the local elections results. The second is that there's no obvious candidate to take over, and importantly, with a fully worked up policy agenda. So I think MPs are wary of the risk of replacing Keir Starmer with someone else, there being a honeymoon, and then 6 months later them being in a similar position. So that all acts in his favour in terms of the fact that MPs are really worried about the next general election, but it takes a lot for Labour MPs to act, and there are things that are holding them back. So he may last longer than some people in the Westminster bubble are predicting. He may even last the year.
Oh, even to the end of the year. Heaven forfend.
I think he could do. I think the Labour Party is notorious for not acting swiftly. That said, what I will say is I think it would be an absolute disaster for the Labour Party to go into the next election with Keir Starmer at the helm, given where his poll ratings are.
Lord Ricketts, do you think today is the last we hear about Olly Robbins involved in this affair, or do you think there's more to come out of it?
I don't think there's more to come out on Olly Robbins. He's going to no doubt have a long discussion about the way he was sacked, and there'll be some kind of employment tribunal case there. I think the fallout for the Prime Minister will go on. But there are new questions that have been raised today that will no doubt echo around Parliament. My concern is the distraction this is from the real issues the Prime Minister needs to grapple with. Of course, the domestic issues, but also the international ones. He's done very well, I think, internationally in his time as Prime Minister. He's got a good reputation abroad. We need him to be out there trying to resolve the problems in the Gulf and help the Ukrainians and the rest of it. All this is consuming bandwidth that I think needs to be applied to the huge international issues, which frankly, overshadow this issue, this row, this difficulty, which will pass, and it will, they will move on from it. But my goodness, it's a political distraction. It's an energy sapping for the Prime Minister when he's got a lot of other things to do. And I think the Foreign Secretary as well. I think the Foreign Secretary now sees that she's going to have to really get stuck into ensuring the Foreign Office is working well with ministers.
And just lastly, Sonia, then, over the last month or so, how high was Keir Starmer's stock price? How had he fared the Iran war? How had it gone down with his MPs? And on the flip side of that, how bad has the last week been for him?
So I agree with Lord Ricketts that he's done a lot better on the international scene than he has the domestic scene. Unfortunately, I don't think that matters as much as some people might wish it to with voters. I think the next general election is going to be all about the state of the economy, how people are feeling at the end of the month. Of course, international events play into that, as we've seen with Iran. But I think there are a lot of people saying, well, look, Keir Starmer's bought himself some more time, he's done really well on the international scene, and Labour MPs are not going to want to switch Prime Minister at a time of global instability. And there may be something to that, but I just think the local election results are going to be dire for Labour. And the emotional experience of seeing those losses, people can say, oh, they're priced in, Labour MPs know how badly they're going to be doing. If you're a Labour MP in an area that's always had a Labour council that's dominated by Labour and you lose a lot of council seats, that is going to have a big emotional impact on Labour MPs. So I don't think the fact that he's done well on the international stage is going to save him politically, I'm afraid.
Well, on that rather damning verdict of the Prime Minister, Lord Ricketts, Sonia Sodha, thank you very much for your time.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
So this morning, we heard from Olly Robbins, and we heard that Number 10 had a, quote, dismissive approach to vetting. Do you think that's good enough from the government?
Well, I don't accept that there was a dismissive approach because the day after Peter Mandelson was announced, given his appointment, which was made on the 20th of December, he was actually emailed to say that an official would be in touch regarding his clearance. There was another email that was mentioned as well, that he was told he'd be going through the vetting process, and it was one of the most important first steps. So vetting, I think, was clearly at the heart of this appointment, and I think he was aware.
Wouldn't it have made a lot more sense to have done these checks before giving Lord Mandelson, a man with quite a checkered history, the job in the first place?
Well, look, I think, the Prime Minister has reviewed and strengthened the process. It cannot be right that any official thinks that they should not be flagging any concerns with the Prime Minister or the ministers, because they are fundamentally accountable to the House and they're accountable to the British public. But I do think it's important to note that actually it is quite common where appointments are announced that vetting takes place afterwards. Sir Olly also told MPs that was actually normally the case. This was certainly not a one-off. This has been a process that has existed, it appears, on many appointments.
But this is a career civil servant that we're talking about here, a man who's served many governments of different colour and different parties, saying that he had, quote, a strong expectation coming from Downing Street that Lord Mandelson, quote, needed to be in post and in America as quickly as humanly possible. This was a man put on unrealistic pressures, wasn't he?
Well, look, I think, what Olly clearly said in the evidence he gave to committee is that he is not somebody who would bow to pressure from anyone. And he was confident that his team were actually handling the process quite well. And this is coming from him. I think, he was well aware that the inauguration was going to take place of President Trump. So clearly there was some kind of time pressure. But the fact that he did say that he wouldn't bow down to pressure, I think is quite clear.
Do you think that during this whole saga, that, quote, full due process was followed?
Well, look, I think, we've got to be clear that there is a UK vetting process. It is right that it's independent. It's got to be independent because we need people to cooperate. Equally, we need to make sure that sensitive information of any person that's part of that process isn't shared across Whitehall. And there's got to be confidence in that process. And I, respect that principle. But, you do have to ask questions. On what basis did Olly Robbins make a decision that he did not then need to flag concerns about somebody failing vetting? Not the content of what was in the UK vetting agency's concerns, but actually to be able to flag to ministers and Prime Minister. I think that's quite an absurd position to be in. When I was out on the doors, certainly people were quite shocked that it was even a process. And I think many of us were quite surprised too, because in the end, it's ministers and the Prime Minister that's accountable to the House and accountable to the British public. So how is it possible that any official would think that actually they don't then need to flag concerns? It's not about sharing the detail. It's about flagging simply that there was a concern in the system.
Keir Starmer stood in front of the House and said 3 times that full due process was followed. Now, it may have been done inadvertently, it may have been done and the Prime Minister didn't want to mislead the House, but doesn't it look like that when the Prime Minister said that full due process was followed and Lord Mandelson had passed his vetting for the job, the House was nonetheless misled?
Well, look, Keir Starmer made very clear in his statement that he had asked the then Cabinet Secretary, Chris Wilmot, to review the process, and he did do that. At no point was it flagged with him by Olly Robbins or any other official that there was a concern in the vetting process. So absolutely, what Keir Starmer relied on is even when he did ask the questions, even when the process was being reviewed, he was told that all those processes had been followed. It has only come to light subsequently that there is a process within the Foreign Office where if somebody doesn't pass the vetting, then they can override clearly that decision. And that is the information that Keir Starmer has found out. That is what he has changed immediately, so that no official should be able to have that level of, autonomy to undertake such a decision. Because in the end, even Olly Robbins is accountable. And how did he decide that it was in his gift not only to make a decision and then have mitigations to address that, but how did he think it was not right to raise that with the Cabinet Secretary when he was asked to review the process, or at every other opportunity that existed for when these questions were being asked?
Are you not the least little bit worried or concerned that there seems to be a culture that has developed in Downing Street in which either people are too scared or just don't want to tell the Prime Minister the uncomfortable truth?
I think, one of the things that this does highlight is clearly there was a culture in the Foreign Office where this is probably seen to be a norm. So I don't know how many times this has happened where, somebody's gone through the vetting process, there needs to be mitigations or there's been flags, and how many other times that they have actually put in place a plan, for example. And clearly the previous government will know much more about that culture. But of course, every government will inherit a culture. And, what this Prime Minister and his cabinet have been trying to do is restore trust back into politics by making sure that there is accountability in the system, but equally making sure that officials are very, very clear as to what is expected. Now, there's been a lot of things, speculation about, the culture within the organisation. At the end of the day, the civil servants are there to serve the British public too.
This is a wider thing than just the culture within the civil service, isn't it? Because in opposition, Keir Starmer said that he's not the sort of person that points a finger at people beneath him. He's the person who takes it on the chin himself. Well, in this circumstance, it's Olly Robbins who is very much having the finger pointed at him. In the past, we've had Sue Gray. She was a person who wasn't up to task and has left office. Matthew Doyle, he's a man who wasn't up to task and now left office. Morgan McSweeney wasn't up to it. He's gone because of Lord Mandelson. Isn't this a Prime Minister who not issue with the Foreign Office. This is an issue with the Prime Minister, who always finds someone else to blame except himself.
I served in Keir Starmer's shadow cabinet. I worked very closely with him. He's a man of great integrity. He takes his public service duty really, really, seriously, and he wants to go on and deliver for the British public. Now, this will be as frustrating as it is for him as it is for anybody else. In the end, he's got to rely on officials and the people around him to carry out the task or the job that he's asked them to do with honesty, and to feed that back. Now, every organisation will have issues like this. Leadership is about addressing those issues. Clearly, some of these individuals were not fit for the jobs that they were given, and they've had to go. And this is a Prime Minister that's really, really clear that he will not sit and wait and let these things continue to fester. He's going to take decision. He's going to change the process, because in the end, he wants to deliver for the British public. We've got a cost of living crisis. We've got a war in Ukraine and Iran, and people are looking to him to help them ease some of those issues that they are facing.
He's got to rely on that team around him, but doesn't all this show that this is a man who's pretty bad at picking that team? Olly Robbins is the latest to go. We've had 2 chiefs of staff. We've had a couple of cabinet secretaries. We've had God knows how many director of communications that have had to go. He's very bad at picking that team, isn't he?
Well, look, the first thing he did was apologise about appointing Mandelson. He made it very clear if he had the information, he would never, ever have appointed him. So I think, he's been very, very clear about his position. Now, look, many of the British public, when I'm out on the doors, are not talking about this issue. This is a very much Westminster obsession about individuals that people don't even know who they are, and their names don't exist. It doesn't mean much to them. They've elected a government to serve them. And what they want to see from this government is delivery on the issues that we had in our manifesto and the issues that they are grappling with at the moment. Now, I hear what you're saying around judgment. The Prime Minister has clearly taken responsibility. Most of the public, when I speak to them, value the fact that the Prime Minister is prepared to do that and then move on and try and address the other issues that he has been elected to do. So I do think it's an unfortunate situation that, have been individuals around Keir that, have not understood this is a man of integrity. And if you are not adhering to the Nolan principles and you're not governing with integrity, then of course he is going to dismiss you.
Preet, Kour, Gill, thank you very much for your time.